Thank you for logging in today. Please take a moment and fill out our poll. We'll be getting started at 1 minute past the hour. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Raheem Thompson. I am the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's booking of the program, And Still We Rise, a novel about genocide in Bosnia with Jordan Sher. Jordan will be joined in conversation this afternoon with Dr. Rebekah Klein-Pejšová, the founding director of Human Rights Program at Purdue University and co-editor. Rebekah, are you here? A second. Yes, so we have Rebekah here. She will give some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll pass it on to Jordan for his PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Raheem. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion with Jordan Sher at the Illinois Holocaust Museum about his book, And Still We Rise, a novel about the genocide in Bosnia. Today, we hold our discussion with awareness of the events unfolding in Ukraine and with awareness of the 30th anniversary of the Siege of Sarajevo, which lasted from the 5th of April, 1992 until the 29th of February, 1996. It was the longest military siege in history. My name is Rebekah Klein-Pejšová, and I'll be moderating the question and answer portion of the program. It's an honor to be here and take part in this important conversation. Please use the Q&A box on your screens to ask questions. You may begin doing so at any time during the first portion of the program with Jordan's presentation. I'll be gathering those questions and reading them aloud to Jordan. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Rebekah, very much for moderating, and thank you, Raheem, and thanks to the museum for inviting me and having me here today. Truly, it is an honor and a privilege. I wanted to first start off by doing this PowerPoint presentation for you, because I think it's important to understand what happened that led to the genocide in Bosnia in 1992. Many people, and I've done presentations, a good deal of presentations in the past few months, and many people do not know what happened in Bosnia and how it led to the genocide. I'll go into more later as to what motivated me to write about this, but I think it's important that we start out with this presentation. So here we go. I titled it, as you can see, Horrors of the Genocide in Bosnia. And really it was important for me to understand and learn, obviously, in my research for the book, And Still We Rise, to know what went on, what transpired, and particularly the human costs. And that certainly, if you do get a chance to read my book, and I hope you do, you'll see what I mean. So let me just start off, because many people don't even know where Bosnia and Herzegovina is. It is sometimes referred to as being in Eastern Europe, sometimes Central Europe. But as you can see, it's bordered by Croatia to the north and Serbia to the east. And those are very important for what events transpired in the early 90s. But if you can take note in the northern, I don't know if you could see, but northern part of Bosnia, Republica Srpska, note the name, and also here in sort of the southeast, Republika Srpska. That'll come into play later, and I'll talk more about it. Okay, so Serb nationalism dominated Yugoslavia before Yugoslavia broke up, essentially into 6 independent nations or states. The presenter here at this speech is President Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic. He was the president of Serbia in the late 80s and in 1992, and was one of the architects of the genocide. And by the way, when I say genocide, some of you may recognize Srebrenica, a place in Serbia where the only war crime deemed a genocide by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia happened in Srebrenica, and it was deemed a genocide. I and others look at the entire campaign by Milosevic and others as a genocidal campaign. But leading up to this, Milosevic in this picture is giving a speech in Kosovo, and it is at a place called Gazimestan, which was a monument in the field of battle for the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. So here he's giving this speech in 1989 to commemorate the 600th anniversary. And this is a very important anniversary date for nationalist Serbs. It is a battle that took place as the Ottoman Empire was spreading Islam. The Ottoman army defeated the Kingdom of Serbia. And in a sense, ever since then, and there are other events certainly between then and even now that have spurred nationalism on the part of Serbs and Bosnian Serbs. But in a sense, that began a push by the Serbs to create what's called a greater Serbia. So that is really an expansion of Serbia. In Yugoslavia, there were many ethnic Serbs in the different republics. So in this case, in Kosovo, Milosevic is giving this speech, and he's speaking to roughly 1 million ethnic Serbs who gathered for this commemoration. And he's whipping up a frenzy of nationalism. And he's basically saying that we are going to repel the Muslim Turks, and we will, avenge this defeat and create, the possibility to have an Orthodox Christian Europe, essentially, or Serbia. So that, and he continued this, there were other commemoration events, and he continued with this type of rhetoric, demonizing Muslims. And the term in Bosnia for Muslims is actually Bosniaks. But that led to 1992 and what began the genocidal campaign. So he continues to spur this nationalism, the us versus them. And again, one of the things I think, well, I know that I want people to understand is there is a universality. When you see us versus them, certainly we see that in many parts of the world. We've seen that in our country, that's not a good sign. And that's what Milosevic and his rhetoric and propaganda preached. Okay, so in 1991, Croatia and Slovenia voted for independence from Yugoslavia. And Milosevic, again, wanted, as president of Serbia, he was also overseeing sort of the presidency of Yugoslavia, but he wanted to see Yugoslavia remain, intact, despite spreading his nationalism. So he had the Yugoslav People's Army, called the JNA, go into Slovenia to try to stop this move toward independence. That war lasted about 10 days, and perhaps it wasn't strategically, necessary for Milosevic to remain. So troops left. Slovenia remained independent, but the troops went into the Yugoslav People's Army. The JNA went into Croatia, and that war lasted closer to 3 years. There are other things involved in terms of Croatia at one point aligning with Serbia. I don't want to get into that now, but essentially, this is what happened. And in the JNA at the time, the Bosniaks and Catholic Croats and Orthodox Christian Serbs, which are the sort of the main constituent groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Bosniaks and Catholic Croats were relieved of their service, and they had required service in the military for the JNA. So it was primarily, these were Serb soldiers and an army for Serbia, in a sense. And then, so at the time, in 1991, the JNA was secretly supplying arms to a Bosnian Serb army led by a man named Ratko Mladic, who is currently serving life imprisonment for the crime of genocide. Okay, so these are the demographics. In 1991, BIH is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you can see that Bosniaks made up 40 of the 4.4 million people. Bosniaks made up 43%, Orthodox Christian Serbs 31%, and Catholic Croats 17%. And then you see others 9%. We can get into later why others is probably not a great way to term it, but the others today even, and I'll get into that in a bit, don't have the same rights as the three main constituent groups even today in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But just for the purposes of this talk leading up to what led to the genocide, these are the demographics. So they voted in March of 92, the Bosnia voted for independence as well. And that began an incursion, and as Rebekah noted earlier, April 5th or April 6th into Sarajevo, but there are other towns in Eastern Europe, Foča is one, Visegrad is another, Visegrad, where the Bosnian Serb army invaded, really in some sense an unsuspecting citizenry, and slaughtered many in villages, began shelling in Sarajevo, and really it opened up their push to towards genocide. Now it was called ethnic cleansing. I think it's a pretty sterile term. They really were looking to eliminate mostly Bosniaks and Catholic Croats. My book begins, at least first part, centers on the concentration camps that were set up by the Bosnian Serbs in Bosnia. Many people are probably not aware of the concentration camps, but there was a very significant system, at least 200 throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. But I've interviewed people who, for example, somebody interviewed who's in a place called Bosanski Novi in central Bosnia, and her father was in a concentration camp, which was located in a hotel in that city. Her uncle was in a fire station across the way that was considered a concentration camp. And I don't believe that those things were counted in this system of 200. But in any event, these are the names up top on this slide. Omarska, Karaterm, Ternopije, and Maniac are the main concentration camps that I focus on in my book. They are located in a place called Prijedor, which is in northwestern Bosnia. And it is there that in late April and then into May, the Bosnian Serb military invaded as well into Prijedor. Now, Omarska is one of the concentration camps, and you can see the picture here. The building in the background, Omarska was actually an iron ore mining company, and it was not functional before this war, before this genocide. It was turned into a concentration camp. The building in front is known as the White House, and that's where many of the prisoners who were starved and beaten, in that main building, but when they were taken out to the White House, many didn't return because of the torture that went on there. Karaterm also had been a ceramics factory on the outskirts of the city of Prijedor, which is in the municipality of Prijedor, which is like our county. Karaterm was a ceramics factory, and that was turned into a brutal concentration camp. Ternopije is actually a little village in the municipality of Prijedor, but the primary school was turned into a concentration camp, and Maniac had been a military base turned prisoner of war camp turned concentration camp. So I recently came across, this is a book I'm in the process of reading, Hikmet Kartic, who actually wrote, not the forward, but the preface for my book. He just came out with a new book, and you could see. And he posits, and as you can read this, it says the primary aspects of the collective traumatization in these camps were torture, sexual abuse, humiliation, and killings. And what he's saying is that the camps were used to create fear so that people would not want to return to Bosnia. And again, I briefly mentioned Milosevic, and there were many more incidents, but a push towards greater Serbia. That was the goal of Serbia, is to cleanse. That's why the Milosevic came up with ethnic cleansing, to cleanse Serbia of Bosnia of non-Serbs. And so these camps really were set up as a way, as part of the campaign, to create this fear through traumatization. Okay. So here's, in my book as well, one of the camps that I'm focusing on is Maniac. And this is just a picture of prisoners in the camp. And this camp was actually they were cattle stalls. Now at the time, because it was mostly spring, summer, and fall that the camps were operating, because they did eventually close down when the world became aware of them through very brave reporting. But in any event, these were cattle stalls. The cattle mostly were out, well, they were out in the fields grazing, and the men were here. And this was where they slept. This is where they sat. This was it. So I just wanted you to, to just see what one of these camps was like. Now, I will tell you, Omarska, from interviews I've had and from readings, of articles and whatnot, Omarska, Karaturm, and Ternopolye, and Manjača in earlier were very, very brutal, very brutal. Manjača was a little less so once the Red Cross got involved and understood what was going on. Okay, this is my friend Satko Mijejic, and you can see he's from in front of the White House. This is maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And as I said, the White House was a place of tremendous brutality and torture and murder at Omarska. And every year, August 6th, there was a commemoration for the closing of Omarska. And many people attend, including Satko and others, and they release white balloons to honor, to commemorate the loss, really. But it's in Republika Srpska. And Republika Srpska, I mentioned that earlier, is actually an entity that was given to the Bosnian Serbs, almost rewarded for their genocide, in order to stop the war. So they were given 49% of Bosnia. And then there's the Federation of Bosnia, which is 51%. And I'll show you in a bit the how this happened. But Omarska is in Republika Srpska. So people are allowed to go on August 6th for a commemoration for 4 hours only. They put a small plaque in the White House to commemorate. And then once the commemoration ends, they take the plaque down, and that's it, because it's in Republika Srpska, which is the seat of genocide denial, actually. It continues to be an issue. We can talk a little about that later, but the genocide denial and sort of the residual effects of that even today. Satko also, by the way, wrote the foreword for my book. And he was in Omarska and Manjača for almost 7 months. And he and I had Zoom conversations for several months. And he told me very openly about what happened to him. So a lot of what happened to him, in addition to the research and readings I've done, are in my book with the characters that I have. Okay, so the Dayton Peace Accords happened on December 14th, 1995. And you can see to the right is Slobodan Milosevic. He was president of Serbia, and to the left is President Izetbegovic, who's president of Bosnia. And they're shaking hands, but I can't help but note on Milosevic's face there's a smirk, because in a sense, and I mentioned before, the genocide heirs were rewarded for what they did by being given Republika Srpska. Okay. In addition, what Dayton did, and it's still reverberating today, is it set up a very unmanageable tripartite government so that the main constituent groups of Catholic Croats, Orthodox Christian Serbs, and Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, each have a representative in the presidency. Mostly they don't get along. There's not a unified, there are not unified policies necessarily. Things do not get done in Bosnia. It's not a really true democracy. And I mentioned before in the demographics, the others tend to be Jews and Roma, or people who consider themselves still Yugoslav or don't identify with any group. They're actually second-class citizens. They cannot run for office, for political office, for example. And this was set up by Dayton. In order to stop the war, there were a lot of concessions. The war did stop, but the country has not been functioning particularly well. It's actually worse lately. There have been court cases. In fact, the Jacob Finci, who's Jewish, and he's the head of, I think a pretty prominent organization in Bosnia, brought a case in the Court of Human Rights in Europe to stop this second-class citizenship so that the people could run for office and do other things. And the Court of Human Rights agreed with him, but Bosnia has still not made the changes. The other thing that was set up with Dayton is what's called the Office of High Representative. And that's where a high representative is appointed every, I don't know if it's 12 years or so, maybe less, but there's somebody new in now since July. And they oversee Dayton courts just to make sure that, excuse me, it's being followed, as closely as possible. One of the problems is the political leader in Republika Srpska, who's the president, one of the three in the tripartite president. His name is Milorad Dodik. He's a genocide denier. And there was a law imposed by the high representative, the outgoing high representative this past summer, saying that anyone who is speaking about or acting upon genocide denial could be prosecuted by the law. And this Milorad Dodik is flaunting that, and he continues to support genocide denial. And in Republika Srpska itself, there are billboards, for example, of Ratko Mladic, who was the general who presided over the Bosnian Serb army as they committed genocide. These things still go on. So and there is a great deal of corruption in the government itself. So it's just, Dayton stopped the war, but it did other things that really were not, that have been very difficult. And I will tell you today, and actually the last number of years, Russia has been meddling in Republika Srpska, has trained military police, has given some military equipment, and Dodik is talking about seceding from Bosnia, which is against Dayton Accords. So it's a mess. It really is. So let me just show you here. This is Republika Srpska, and again, you see the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Republika Srpska has 49% of the land, and this is how it is set up. But it's very different. Like even their education system in Republika Srpska, the history books that the kids read, the students read, praise their war heroes, mention nothing about the atrocities. Okay, then there was the ICTY, and that was a criminal tribunal to indict and then convict the architects of the genocide, which include Milosevic, who actually, while waiting for sentence in 2006, died of a heart attack. But Radovan Karadzic, who was the president of Republika Srpska early on and a genocide heir himself, he and Mladic the general, are spending life in prison for their crimes. It lasted all of these years. It spanned 2003 to 2017. The ICTY convicted 62 Serb criminals. Many still roam free in Republika Srpska. The guards who were in the concentration camps roam free, soldiers, and it's very, very disconcerting to those Bosniaks who still live in Republika Srpska to see maybe the person who tortured or killed your uncle is roaming free. Okay, so the human costs, essentially, there were 25 to 35,000 civilians, Bosniak civilians murdered. There are a total of 100,000 Bosniaks, because an army did eventually, there was no army initially when Bosnia first voted for independence in March of '92. Eventually, there was a resistance and then an army. A total of 100,000 Bosniaks were killed, upwards of 35,000 civilians, upwards of 50,000 women and girls raped. And that was a horrific, but a tool of war that was used by the Bosnian Serbs. And there were militias who were actually criminal gangs. We're seeing some of that in Ukraine now too. There were 1,000 religious sites that were destroyed. And here you can see, this is a cemetery in a place called Potečari, which is where the Srebrenica Memorial Center is. And it's very much, and it's in Republika Srpska, but it's very much like Holocaust museums. And every July, to commemorate the Srebrenica genocide, which resulted in the murders of 8,372 men and boys, when remains are found, they are buried, and there's a ceremony held in Potečari, in the Srebrenica Memorial Center. Okay. So I see my book as a way of doing my part to give voice to truth. Many people I've spoken with, many who are Bosnian, have said to me, we want our stories told. Others have said, we can't tell our stories, it's just too difficult, but not enough is known and not enough people are given voice or even hearing about the truths of what happened. And with the genocide denial and revisionism and glorification of war heroes on the part of Republika Srpska, many in Serbia and other places, it's reason for books like mine to be out there. So I will stop here, and Rebekah, I guess we can take questions.
Thank you very much, Jordan.
You're welcome.
For your presentation. This historical background, I think, is essential for understanding the situation and for your motivations for writing the book. We do have our first question in, and so I think it's a good place to start. It's a question from Mary Sherhart, and she asks, why is it that in reporting about the war in Ukraine, many say nothing like it has happened since World War II? It seems that the genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina is overlooked.
Thank you. And it's a very accurate assessment. I'm part of an advocacy group called Working Group for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they're very prominent, very wonderful people. I've learned a lot from them. And that is one of the things that we're trying to make connection in terms of our advocacy, whether through media or elected officials, is very much what is happening in Ukraine happened in Bosnia. And I think the reason that Bosnia is sort of off the radar, and one of the things I will say, and I say it in articles I've written, it may even be in this book, that this is actually the worst atrocities on European soil. What happened in Bosnia is the worst atrocities on European soil since World War II. Back in '92, the US and European countries really avoided getting involved. The propaganda from the West, in a sense, was these are long-standing ethnic conflicts between Muslims and Christians and Catholics, and we're not going to get involved. Well, as you can, from the little bit I present, you can see this had nothing to do with long-standing conflict. In fact, people I speak with said that they all get along. They were so surprised that their neighbors turned on them. But I think because it strategically, it was very small. Bosnia is a small place. There was the line that it's longstanding ethnic conflict. We're not going to get involved. And frankly, and we see it. There's the stereotyping of Muslims, and Milosevic used that very well. he called them Muslim extremists, Muslim terrorists. And so the US and others, I don't think they saw it as important at that time. Now, just one last thing. It really is important because right now, I said Russia had meddled in with Republika Srpska, and they're supporting Republika Srpska seceding from Bosnia. The concern now is that because Bosnia wants to join NATO, they could be targeted next by Russia. And to be honest, if you track back and look at the Dayton Peace Accords, it really unraveled a lot of what we're seeing now. And so lack of recognition of Bosnia has caused some major problems in the world today.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, related to that, as more questions are coming in, if the events as they're unfolding today in Ukraine has affected the way you understand the situation in Bosnia.
Oh, okay, so maybe can you
Yeah, so
the second part?
you know, we're having our discussion today against a backdrop of these currently unfolding events and revelations, and I know it's on all of our minds as we're talking, and I wonder if learning about those events or the way which we're becoming aware of those events has affected how you understand the situation in Bosnia.
My hope is that that people understand what happened in Bosnia, seeing what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, we just heard, was it yesterday, the day before, execution of civilians. That very thing happened to villagers in Bosnia. They were slaughtered, executed, put in mass graves. So, Ukraine certainly has a much bigger presence. We also have 24/7 cable news. We're seeing these things, social media. That really wasn't so prominent in the early 90s. My hope is people do make the connection and see that actually that Russia has been very much supporting these efforts, and now we see it so plainly, on cable news. So it doesn't necessarily, for me and for those who are following, who follow Bosnia and writing books about it, it hasn't, I think the way it's informed me is right now, the world, Western world, I guess, seems unified in its opposition to Putin. There was not that during the 90s for Bosnia. It was quite the opposite.
All right. Now I'd like to move to a question that addresses the genocide itself. So the situation during the genocide, and particularly sexual assaults. And so there's a question here from Pamela Mitchell, who's asking about where the statistics for the 50,000 rapes come from, how do we verify the number? How accurately can we verify that number?
No, and that's a very good question. And maybe I should say it's estimated that 20,000 to 50,000. There are various organizations, whether it's the UN, other groups, and I've read, as I was preparing myself to write the book, I did a lot of reading. I read through the ICTY, the criminal tribunal proceedings, some of those, written articles, statistics, because I wanted to be as accurate as possible. So those statistics they're not made up. They're clearly a tool of war. We're starting to see, from what we're hearing, that we're seeing that in Russia as well. And it's represented, not the statistics, but rape as a tool of war is represented in one of the characters in my book, in Ternopil, a concentration camp, because I think it's important to tell that story. It also, from my reading of other genocides and other wars, in Tigray, for example, sadly, that rape and sexual assault is a tool of war, and was not just in Bosnia, but it seems to be that is what happens generally, and perhaps needs to be more publicly recognized.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to a couple of questions that concern the aftermath of war, one about continuing tensions and one about the Bosnian diaspora, particularly Bosnian diaspora in the US. But first, I'll ask a question from Kate Powers, who is joining us from Sarajevo. She writes Pozdrav Sarajevo. For those who follow Bosnia, we have heard repeatedly over the last 6-ish months that tension and risk of conflict recurring is at its highest since 1995. What is your assessment of a return to violence, and how has the war in Ukraine affected that? Does it make violence in Bosnia more or less likely? We might think too, in relation to that, the recent elections over the weekend, re-electing Vučić as in Serbia.
Right, and Orban. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for Kate, being in Sarajevo, she probably has much more a bird's eye view of what's going on. And I do have certainly allies in Bosnia, and Kate may relate to this. There is a great deal of worry because Dodik and even the RS, the Republika Srpska Assembly, voted for secession. They can't quite do it, but they voted in their assembly to secede from the Federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which goes against the Dayton Accords. As I said, Russia, it's becoming, and I've read articles recently, it's become much more evident that Russia has trained military police. They were involved, there were Russian militias that were involved in Sarajevo and in the war in the 90s, on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs. So Russia's been very much involved, and whether Russia is saying their goal, ridiculously, of course, denazification is a ridiculous thing, but Putin is basically saying that we don't want any other countries to join NATO. It threatens us. So you have the likes of Vučić in Serbia and Orban who's saying, we agree, we don't want to antagonize Russia, and they're actually allies to Russia. So from what we have read, maybe the heat's been turned down slightly, but I don't really think so. And I think those who are living in Bosnia particularly are feeling it. And again, will the US and the West, right now, very, very allied against Russia in Ukraine, I'm not totally convinced from what we're seeing out of our government here, that I don't know where we'll be at. Should there be trouble in Bosnia? I don't know.
Right. And we should remember that everyone in the region is very concerned in Central and Eastern Europe and Europe overall. And one of the reasons for the overwhelming victory of, say, Orban in Hungary on Sunday and Vučić was that they ran on the platform of peace and stability, peace and security, because, and this addressed people's immediate fears, seemed to override everything else.
Right. And yet they're allies to Dodik and Republika Srpska and to Putin. So.
Right, they're carrying out this very dangerous balance at this moment. I'm going to shift now to this question from Andrew Mikolajczyk, who's asking about Bosnians who came to the US in the 90s. If we can think about the growing Bosnian diaspora of the 90s, and what are the centers of Bosnian American communities in the US? And he's saying, for example, that this is wonderful, Andrew. I'm so glad to hear that we've helped dozens of Bosnian Americans in the Chicago area. So yes. Kudos to you.
Yeah, and again, there are roughly 300,000 Bosnians who came here as refugees to this country. Chicago and St. Louis probably have the most, the largest Bosnian community. But there are certainly many other places. And in my book, the last few chapters, the family, the protagonists in my book, end up in Utica, New York, which has Relatively strong, not certainly as large as Chicago or St. Louis, but a relatively strong Bosnian community. And these are folks like I guess, many refugees who, and they're not refugees now, but who've come in and left the horrors of war, found the relative safety of their homes in the U.S., have become part of the community. But people people that I've been in touch with here in the diaspora are also very much a part of the Bosnian community. It's remained very strong. I will tell you though, earlier in March, I did a book tour in Utica. And one of the places I presented, a local college, there were 3 women who had left Bosnia, during the war, and they live in Utica. And they were all feeling very worried, seeing what was going on in Ukraine. They're also saying that over the last few years, because of the sort of the othering, the us versus them, that they were feeling, one of them even said, I wondered, we left because of the hate. And here we are now in recent years, we're hearing, whether it's the Muslim travel ban or, other refugees coming to this country. And she said, I wouldn't know where else to move. I don't know where to go, but she said, it crossed my mind to leave. She's not going to, of course. And she's very much a part of a strong Bosnian community in Utica, but there's certainly concern again.
Yeah. That this is something that, there's a student currently that I have who's been in touch with you, working on research project coming from the Chicago area, and is increasingly worried about the family there, and thinking about what there's nowhere else really to go. What I'm going to ask you a question. Since you mentioned the book tour and you're reflecting more on the process of the book, I'd like to ask you about what challenges you encountered in researching and writing the book that you did not expect as you're working through this material. There must have been challenges that you did expect, and there are challenges that you didn't expect.
That's a very good question. I don't know, because I'm someone who seems to take on challenges and kind of absorb them and move forward. I think probably this is, as noted, Satko Mujagic, who was in both Omarskan and Maniac. I found him. He was doing a YouTube interview. He lives in Brussels. And he was doing a YouTube interview because I was trying to do research about Prijedor, and because I was getting ready to, figure out what I'm going to do in terms of writing the book. And I reached out to Satko, and he agreed to meet with me, which is really cool. He's an activist. He's very well known in sort of the world, related to Bosnia. But at the beginning, he said to me, "You're not Bosnian." He recognized I'm an American Jew. I'm second generation American Jew. And certainly I've had family who I know we've lost in the Holocaust. I have certainly that connection. And I think that's what touched me originally, because I didn't know a lot about Bosnia. Hearing similarities, certainly not to the degree, but the intent on the part of the Bosnian Serbs, certainly on the part of the Nazis. So Satko and I talked very openly about it, but he said, as a non-Bosnian, he said, I appreciate you wanting to write the book, but if you don't write this as authentically and genuinely as should be told, he said, I'm not going to continue to meet with you. And I had always had in my mind, I would like him to write the foreword. I wouldn't dare bring it up until I sort of, he's a very exacting man, cool guy, but he said, I won't really promote the book or anything unless I know that this is done the way it should be. So he also took the manuscript. This is probably the most challenging part. He agreed to take my manuscript, and he would comment on it and say, it couldn't happen this way. The timeline isn't good. You're demonizing the Serbs. You shouldn't be doing that because some actually helped. That really was challenging. in a sense, because I really wanted a lot of ways meet his expectations. The end of the book, I asked him, after the manuscript was written, I asked him if he'd write the foreword, and he said yes. And in fact, it's on the back of the book. He said, "This is the best truth-based fiction about the concentration camps in Bosnia ever written," which really flattered me. So I guess I met his expectations. But that was probably the biggest challenge along the way. And I guess in addition, he was very open about what the torture was like. And that's hard to hear. And in the book, there are some graphic scenes, but that's what happened. And it's not certainly the purpose of me writing the book. But a lot of that comes from what I've read and what Sako experienced.
It's important to convey it in the work. I have a related question to ask you that has to do with your background. So I don't remember you mentioning it in today's event, but we know that you have a background as a social worker. And you just mentioned your Jewish background and that you do know that you've lost family in the Holocaust. And I wonder how this background has affected your approach to the work, if it made it easier for you, if it made it more difficult for you, if it increased your connection to Bosnia.
When we're talking about background, you're saying both my professional background and also personally family history. Absolutely, it did. And I in terms of family history, like I said, I just didn't know very much about what happened in Bosnia. And I certainly do know a lot about the Holocaust, and I grew up, maybe as those some of you in the audience, you grew up knowing about the Holocaust, and being very aware of what our place is in the world as Jews. But when I heard originally, for the first book I wrote, I interviewed two women who were children in Bosnia at the time of the war, and it just blew me away. And I said, this is reminiscent of what happened. And I didn't know a lot about it, and maybe people don't know a lot about it. So I really need to learn more. The other part is, as a social worker for a number of years, I worked with people who had experienced trauma. And so I was able to put that sort of informed my writing, because I want to make this as human, and have people understand through my characters how human, the experience of trauma and it certainly can result in people going in so many directions. I try to, in the book, really speak to the resilience of people, but also that it is a life of trying to find balance for someone who's experienced trauma, whether in war or community or whatever. And it's a lifetime of really trying to find some sense of healing and balance. And I hope that comes through in my book.
Thank you. So there are a couple of other questions here about current tensions. And the first one has to do with the relationship between Croatians and Bosniaks. And this question comes from Heather McCormiss. And Heather is asking, can you speak to the relationship between Croatians and Bosniaks? My understanding was that initially the Croatians were also fighting against Bosniaks in the 90s, but joined forces later in the conflict. Is there any hope that Bosniaks/Croatians could partner to establish a more functional government than was established via the Dayton Accords, realizing that the Croatian population in Bosnia and Herzegovina isn't as large as the Bosniaks and Serbs?
Right. Back in the early 90s, President Tudjman of Croatia did ally with Milosevic because there's this sort of goal of creating a greater Croatia. I think they were looking to split Bosnia and Herzegovina between Serbia and Croatia. So there was actually, at one point, Bosnia had a two-front war with both Croatia and Serbia. Eventually, I think it was in 94, early 94 or so, that Bosnia and Croatia made peace, and Croatia turned back around and allied with Bosnia to fight Serbia. The way the government's set up today and via Dayton is this tripartite governments. You have representative from the main constituent groups, Catholic, Croat, Orthodox, Serb, Christian, and Bosniak, Muslim. And so it's a very ethnically divided government. It's a very ethnically divided country still. Ethno-nationalism is premier amongst many, particularly a lot of politicians who, there is a great deal of corruption, who gain favor by keeping the divisions as such. The president representing the Croatian National Party, his name is Komšić, but he is very much a supporter of true democracy in Bosnia. So between him and the representative from Bosniak party, there is a strong alliance. But I will tell you, there are still many sections of cities, small cities and villages that are very homogeneous in terms of their ethnicity, and that still remains. I don't know, and maybe Kate or someone can speak to this, about relations between Croats and Bosniaks. I think it's certainly much better, much better, because there's not the denial on the part of Croats like there are for many Bosnian Serbs in RS. But I think one of the issues is that government, that Dayton stopped the war. It didn't go, it's really made for a lot of trouble now. And there needs to be true democratic reform, not based on constituent groups or ethnicity or religion. I think that will probably go a long way to at least beginning to solve the tensions that are there.
Your answer and your last sentence there feeds right into this question that Farouk Elbasic has, who put the question. Farouk's question is: as an outsider, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the ultimate solution in Bosnia, given the issues and high level of government dysfunctionality with the Dayton Peace Agreement. So it's related again to the legacies of the dysfunctionality within the Dayton Agreement.
Right, and again, here's the caveat. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a historian. I speak to you from having done volunteer advocacy with the working group of Bosnia and Herzegovina, allies I've met, people I've met along the way, and it's just, these are things that I've learned about. So I can only speak from that perspective. Dayton, again, what I see was a blueprint that resulted in aggression, and aggression, particularly on the part of Republika Srpska Dodik and his party, honestly, I think if there is not, and I don't know the answer, but if there is not this constitutional and democratic reform going forward, but there's not a lot of will to do it on the part of the major parties because they're benefiting from the power of ethnic division. If there's not, I think we're just looking to continue a risk of internal conflict and war. So I don't know politically how that all works. I know, for example, I will give an example. The US, I'm not sure how much many yet have learned in terms of our government, because there's a push towards electoral reform in Bosnia that some of our diplomats are supporting. And that electoral reform actually would result in tipping the balance toward nationalists, toward ethno-nationalists, Croatian nationalists within Bosnia and Herzegovina. The electoral reform always sounds good because you're talking about electoral reform, but my understanding is that it actually will make things much worse. And we in the working group are trying to advocate for that not to happen, that the really constitutional reform is going to create a more whole and democratic society. So that we get rid of Dayton and actually everyone, all people in Bosnia have the same rights. And as I had mentioned earlier, there are those who don't.
Right. It's one of our aspirations. I have one more comment here that is in the Q&A. This is from Andrew, and my apologies, Andrew, for pronouncing your name incorrectly before. It's Mikołajczyk. And he comments here, thank you, Jordan Sher, for your research, and to me for addressing questions. It's informative. He wants us to know that our team is helping many Bosniaks in Chicago and the Edgewater area with housing and many other social programs. We hear many traumatic stories about the war in the 90s. We look for ways to support and enhance our services. We also help many Holocaust survivors. We have also been supporting many Ukrainians, and we want to expand our services. And he would like to connect you with his professional colleagues and know about anything else you might be able to share. And he includes his email here, which I can give you later, or Andrew, you can let me know in the box if you want that to be publicly shared. But I will definitely pass that on.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And quite honestly, I've told people who read the book or certainly interested even beyond the book and things that I'm talking about, I am more than happy to communicate with. There was, in fact, in Utica when I was there was a teacher, a history teacher, one of the local high schools, who said that she is going to have, trying to get rid of this, she's going to have her students read my book. And then I said, here's my email address. I'd be happy to visit with your class virtually. I mean, one person or several people, so I appreciate Andrew wanting to connect with professionals, because it's really important for all of us to know, to share with each other about these issues.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I would add, I'm just going to put a quick plug before we wrap up, because I think we're just about out of time, and I'm going to turn over to Rahim. But I want to mention, I'm here at Purdue University in Indiana, and we've just instituted a program to host 20 students and scholars from Ukraine here at Purdue. And if you are interested or know somebody who may be interested in that, please contact me. I will put my email address in the chat in a moment. I want to thank you all for attending. We've had a chance to discuss a good number of questions, and to thank Jordan again for all of your work and for writing this book and for doing these presentations about your work. So thank you all, and I will turn it over to you now, Rahim. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you as well, Jordan. And for everyone in attendance, thank you for joining us this afternoon. When you have a chance, please go purchase the book, and Still We Rise. I read it, and I think it's great. And Jordan, do you have any way that they can contact you if they want to support your work going forward? Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, thanks, Rahim. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly visit my website, and I don't know if that's something you could put up. Jordan Stephen Sher, STEVN, JordanStevensher.com, Jordan Stephen Sher. You can purchase my book that way. You can also read about other things I'm doing. You could just simply go to Amazon or your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it for you. There is a contact page on my website. If you want to get in touch with me, please feel free. And I can give you my email address too, which is fine, but I think through the contact page, you'll get in touch with me and then we can share more. And I guess I'm always open to people reaching out to me, and I appreciate it too. So yeah, that's it. And Raheem, again, thanks a lot for inviting me here today.
Yeah, no problem. And to everyone still in attendance, if you have a chance, please take a moment to fill out our survey. It's in the chat. It will also be sent to you directly when you close the Zoom. And also see our website for our upcoming programs. And thanks again, Jordan and Rebekah.
You're welcome. Okay.
Have a great day.
Thank you too.